Good morning. Welcome to the first full day of the Fall 2014 Mansfield Conference. I'm Rob Saldine. I direct the project on American democracy and citizenship. I'm also one of the organizers of this conference, along with Dane Scott, the director of the Mansfield Program on Ethics and Public Affairs, and Zach Porter of the Montana Wilderness Association, and former Congressman Pat Williams. Last week, as many of you know, marked the 50th anniversary of President Lyndon Johnson signing the Wilderness Act into law. And our conference is tasked with considering the legacy of that law here in Montana and considering the current and future challenges surrounding wilderness. Over the next 2 days, we'll be looking at wilderness through various lenses, including those of history, philosophy, economics, science, arts and literature, and politics. We do have some flyers like this right out at just outside the door at the table there. Encourage you to pick one of those up. They contain a full schedule with all the listings for the panels and the speakers. But I'd like to draw your attention to one event that deviates a bit from the typical conference proceedings. Tonight, beginning at 6:30, we're hosting a celebration downtown at the Top Hat. There will be readings by Charmin Russell, who is a University of Montana graduate from the Creative Writing Program, and David James Duncan, whose work is well known. Those begin at 7:30. And that will be followed by music featuring wartime blues. This event is free, it's open to the public, and we certainly encourage you to attend. Now I'd like to very briefly introduce Professor Bill Borrie, who will be the moderator for our first session. Dr. Borrie is a native of Melbourne, Australia, but he's been here at the University of Montana as a faculty member for nearly 20 years. He's published over 40 articles on issues including the meaning of parks and wilderness, and he's conducted extensive field work in Yellowstone, the Bob Marshall, the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, and the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, among many other places. In 2012, the Chief of the U.S. Forest Service presented Dr. Borrie with the Excellence in Wilderness Stewardship Research Award. Please help me welcome Dr. Bill Borrie.
Thank you, Rob. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Donald Worster, who from 1989 to 2012 held the Hall Distinguished Professorship Chair in American History at the University of Kansas. Professor Worster is a native of Kansas, a son of the Great Plains, who earned both his bachelor's and master's from KU. His doctorate in American History and Literature is from Yale University. In addition to his many years teaching at the University of Kansas, Professor Worster also taught at the University of Hawaii and Brandeis University and has held research fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, Mellon Foundation, National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Australian National University. He was elected in 2009 to membership of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, one of the nation's most prestigious honorary societies, alongside his elected membership of the Society of American Historians. Several of his books have been nominated for Pulitzer Prizes. Many would consider Professor Worster a founder, a pioneer, and a patriarch of environmental history. He was president of the American Society for Environmental History and a founding editor of the Cambridge University Press monograph series, Studies in Environment and History. Of his 8 books, numerous articles, chapters, and edited volumes, I choose to focus on 5. Beginning with Nature's Economy, a history of ecological ideas in 1977, later enlarged in a second edition in 1994, we see a scholar analyzing the field of ecology within its historical context. Professor Worster is an intellectual historian, as much interested in the origin of ecological ideas and the ways that they have grown up and influenced the fabric of society as the ecological notions themselves. That is, the story of the relationship that humans have with nature is as much about the human context as it is about the nature in which humans find themselves. Similarly, we might say that the discussion of science-based management is as much about the language used and the social and political context in which it is used as it is about the science. Professor Worster is a student of the American landscape, and his next two books, Dust Bowl, The Southern Plains in the 1930s, published in 1979, and Rivers of Empire, Water, Aridity, and the Growth of the American West, published in 1985, are also big topics, focusing on what's the right thing to do about the plains, the great rivers, and the arid lands. From there, I'll draw your attention to the two giant biographies of two icons of the story of the American West. In 2001, A River Running West, the life of John Wesley Powell, and in 2008, A Passion for Nature, the life of John Muir. These two gentlemen were visionaries, great figureheads of the conservation movement in the United States. John Wesley Powell is sometimes considered the last major explorer in the lower 48, having voyaged twice down the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River, and also helping found and lead the US Geological Survey, the USGS. John Muir is also quite known for his adventures through the Sierra Nevada mountains in California, his 1,000-mile walk to the Gulf of Mexico, and his explorations of Glacier Bay, Alaska, as well as his efforts to establish Yosemite National Park and the founding of the Sierra Club. But the Worster biographies are not only defining documentaries of these familiar tales, they also ponder the economic, the social, and the political times of Powell and Muir. We see these two as having complex and evolving worldviews, not as one-dimensional ideologues. Worster provides a rich background for the growing up, the nurturing, and sometimes the internally conflicting views that Powell and Muir give voice to. Though both would be considered conservationists, one had a fairly utilitarian or resourcist relationship with nature, Powell, and one had a more intrinsic or ecocentric view. And I don't believe that the selection of these two giants is happenstance. But in the full context of Worster's nuanced and insightful scholarship, even those labels are insufficient. We're very fortunate then to be hearing from Professor Donald Worster. In the last 5 years, he has held the position of Distinguished Foreign Expert at Renmin University in China. And it's partially within that social context that he will talk this morning on wilderness from the American West to the world. Would you please welcome Professor Worster back to the University of Montana and to the 2014 Mansfield Conference, The Storied Past, Troubled Future, the Imperative of Wilderness at 50 Years.
Oh, thank you, Bill. And it is good to be back. I've been to this campus 3 or 4 times in my career, most recently at the invitation of Dan Flores, who apparently has departed the state. How could anybody leave Montana for New Mexico? Well, I could leave for New Mexico about this moment. I forgot to bring enough winter clothing, so my teeth are chattering. I say that because if my voice begins to sound a little strange, it's because of the teeth problem this morning. I went looking for a T-shirt in the center of this town, and there ain't anything like that for sale under $30 that I could find. I'm not spending that kind of money for my teeth. Well, in this time of apocalyptic dread, especially among environmentalists and Hollywood filmmakers, I think we should keep 2 large, happy truths in mind. First, nature is in fact adapting and surviving all over the planet, and doing so even in places that have been devastated by humans. Nature is showing what a tough old broad she is. Second, this process of recovery can use our help, and fortunately, there has never been a time when so much money expertise, and compassion have been devoted to nature conservation all over the earth. These facts should give us hope, constrained, cautious, but hope all the same. They should give us plenty to celebrate in this 50th anniversary year of the Wilderness Act. We live in the midst of a serious environmental crisis, but we live also amidst a growing concern and a greater understanding of the earth. I call this concern the higher altruism. An altruism that goes above and beyond humans, that is ecological in concept and revolutionary in impact. My argument this morning is that protecting wilderness is fundamentally an expression of that higher altruism. But first, let me tell you what I see from my back porch in rural Kansas, and what that seeing has led me to see elsewhere on the planet. Now, I come here humbly. You have to come to Montana humbly when you're from Kansas. I know you look down on Kansas and the prairies and so forth, but bear with me, because I think I have a larger message that Montanans might profit from. First, let me, as I say, tell you about this. I look out on old farm pastures that are going back to native grasses and trees with a little help from me. Beginning in the mid-19th century, the land was cleared for crops and grazed heavily. But in the 1970s, the Army Corps of Engineers arrived to build a huge flood control dam, and in the process acquired nearly 10,000 acres of farmland to protect as watershed. The dam was an expensive boondoggle, but it brought some positive changes. A handful of farms went out of production, and nature began to restore itself under mild human protection. No one planted any trees, but there they are today, an entire forest of native species, covering at least half of the core land, a forest so dense and tangled that one can hardly walk through it. Out of the forest have drifted clouds of seeds that are constantly trying to reclaim my property. And after years of trying to slow it down, this takeover, in order to raise a few sheep and a few vegetables, I no longer have the energy or the inclination to do much about it. I'm 73 years old. I give up. Deer, coyotes, beaver, wild turkeys have come out of the regenerating forest, along with bobcats, wild boars, and believe it or not, an elusive cougar or two. This is a rewilding place. Kansas has no designated wilderness. Its rich soils attracted too many farmers who plowed their way to prosperity. Yet even here in this intensely managed state of soybeans, corn, wheat, wild nature is on the rise. Thanks not only to the Corps of Engineers, but also to non-governmental conservation groups, land trust especially, and to people like me, but also thanks to the resilient power embedded in a wild seed. About half of each year I leave my porch and go to live on the campus, as you heard, of a Chinese university, smack in the middle of Beijing among 20 million other people. Snarling traffic jams and sometimes badly polluted air. And despite these often dreary conditions, along with the citizens of Beijing, I eat very well. My main reason for going. Chinese food is always worth celebrating. Can we put that up on the celebration today? Not only is the food good and usually safe, but also we enjoy millions of trees and flowers planted along the city streets and in large new urban parks and far into the hinterland by the Chinese government. Such plantings give me hope that eventually a wilder nature will return even to China. I should interject here that China actually has more land in a state of de facto wildness than the United States. We're the same size geographically, but a couple of surveys have shown that China has as much as 22% of its land without roads, without mines, without any kind of modern agricultural production and so on. The world's most populous country is at last trying to heal its land and protect endangered species, to create large nature reserves and overcome the curse of too many peasants. I love peasants, but this is a country where tigers and elephants once were common everywhere until peasant farmers pushed them out, leaving much of the countryside beaten and silent. Yet after more than 5,000 years of agrarian and now industrial exploitation, China harbors a greater biodiversity of plants and animals than the United States. With the advice of the Nature Conservancy, the country has created a national biodiversity conservation strategy and action plan that aims to halt any further loss of its natural diversity by the year 2020. Chinese nature, with the help of humans, is rewilding too. The success of this plan will depend on a lot of factors. It's unpredictable, of course, as Chinese politics are unpredictable. But one trend seems fairly certain to allow the recovery of wild nature. The human population is beginning to fall. Not everywhere, but significantly in many places. By the end of this century, China will count far fewer inhabitants than the 1.3 billion it now has. The one-child per family policy, which was introduced in 1979, one of Mao Zedong's last acts, has reduced the country's projected population by 700 million people. And if that continues, it will reduce the numbers by another 300 to 400 million people or more. And when that happens, nature will rush to fill the vacuum. And then the elephants, if they are not extinct, may return. Population restraint will eventually become global, with huge implications for the human footprint that we are making on the planet. The United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs has projected a global population peak of 9.22 billion in the year 2072, followed, they say, by a steady state for another century or two. The UN is probably wrong on that prediction. We may never reach a steady state. A couple of scholars in Vienna at the Institute for Applied Systems Analysis argue that a massive demographic decline, not a steady state, may lie in our future. Europe's fertility rate has already fallen to 1.5 children per woman. If the world's rate falls to the same level, and it seems likely that it will, then by the year 2200, I won't be around, you won't be around, but we're talking history here, the human population will be only half of what it is today. And by 2300, it will be no more than 1 billion, about what it was in the year 1800. If that happens, then much of the Earth's surface will no longer be required for agriculture, settlements, or industry. Nature will restore itself. Many will not welcome this decline in human numbers. They will fight hard to encourage more fertility among women and to keep the human footprint large. But today, women are resisting that pressure to sacrifice their lives and bodies to constant childbearing, while a strong global current is running towards seeing nature restored, species saved from extinction, and ecosystems protected from disintegration. This is happening because we are learning to think in new ways about our role in and our dependence on the natural world. And in that process, we are becoming more, not less, human. Only the human species could decide to bear fewer offspring or to work hard to prevent another creature's extinction or to restore Earth's ecosystem. I mean, conservation is all the way through nature. The conservation of energy and matter is found all through the plant and animal kingdom, but not the conservation of other species, of wholeness and balance, of endangered communities. Those require a process of learning that no other species can achieve. We humans are learning to acknowledge that not everyone or everything has the same needs or perspective, but that all are necessary to the whole. Learning interdependence is the foundation of altruism. When we learn how our lives are tied to the ecosphere, we are ready to moderate our self-serving instincts for the good of others. Nature, of course, is the ultimate source of all altruism. It began with our biological ancestors. We didn't invent it, and we have no monopoly on it. The great theoretician of evolution, Charles Darwin, understood that contrary to the law of competition and natural selection, an individual organism may sacrifice itself for the welfare of another. Why? How? That a mother may sacrifice her life for her offspring, or an ant to save its colony. But the moral imperative that I call the higher altruism, which is a concern for the welfare of all species and the interdependence of nature, is a result not simply of biological, but also of cultural evolution. The Wisconsin conservationist Aldo Leopold called it the land ethic. Today we might talk about not simply the land ethic, but our responsibilities to water, air, biodiversity, wildness on the planet. Planet Earth, we have learned, may not need us in the long run. It does not need us in the long run. But it needs us now at this moment of crisis. It needs our capacity for altruism. And we need to think about the earth more altruistically for the sake of our own survival, to be sure. But also because we are moral creatures. Caring for the earth seems the right thing to do. Nearly 80 years ago, in 1935, a small group of altruistic pioneers joined together to form the Wilderness Society. They included Leopold, Bob Marshall, Robert Sterling Yard, Benton Mackay. Some of those names are on the walls around here. By the way, none of them came from west of the Mississippi, most of them actually from the eastern part of the United States. But all of them were worried about the spread of the automobile and roads into the last wild places of the country. All of them had been inspired by the writings of Thoreau, George Perkins Marsh, John Muir. But it was the son of a Pennsylvania preacher, Howard Zahniser, a journalist in government service, round-faced, mild-mannered, spectacles, loved to read as well as hike, who surpassed them all in getting protection, legal protection for America's last remaining wilderness. 10 years after its founding, the Wilderness Society made Zahniser the editor of its magazine and then hired him as executive secretary. It was Zahniser who wrote the bill to establish a legal framework for wilderness. After a decade of patient, relentless lobbying, Congress passed his bill, as you now know, probably knew before this meeting was scheduled, in 1964. So it took altogether 30 years of organizing and working to get wild places and wild creatures protected from roads and other economic development. Mark Harvey, who has written a definitive biography of Zahniser, describes him as a man who turned to nature rather than his father's biblical God. The preacher's son argued, very quietly, gently, that humans need the peace and solitude of the wilderness, that going to the wilderness provides a spiritual recreation or recreation. But wilderness should be protected, and I was pleased to hear this echoed last night among our panelists, protected for more than human needs. Harvey writes that Zahniser quote, believed in community and thought that wilderness experiences would help foster a greater sense of the bonds between man and nature and among mankind itself. It seems good, quoting Sennheiser, to consider ourselves as members of a community of life that embraces the earth and sees our own welfare as arising from the prosperity of that community. That sounds a lot like the ethicist Aldo Leopold talking. The Wilderness Act was not the first expression of the higher altruism, but it marks its legislative emergence. James Morton Turner, in his book, The Promise of Wilderness, which examines the subsequent history of the Wilderness Act after 1964, stresses what he calls the pragmatism that conservationists like Sennheiser followed before and after the Act's passage. They did not insist on philosophical absolutes or ecological absolutes. And they scattered their arguments as widely as possible. Often they appealed to broad national values like patriotism or America's frontier legacy. But I would insist it was not patriotism or frontier nostalgia that kept Sennheiser and his fellow society members devoted to their task. It was a deeply felt but pragmatic moral vision of protecting wild places and wild things. You heard also last night the Act went through more than 60 revisions before it gained the approval of Congress, as well as many conservation groups that weighed in, most of them still thinking in utilitarian and anthropocentric terms. Sennheiser was eager to get votes wherever he could get them, and he used whatever appeal seemed to work. But unmistakably, he and his fellow members of the Wilderness Society wanted to change the focus of conservation away from human needs and material demands and toward emphasizing our moral obligations to the natural world. This is not about recreation in simply hiking, backpacking terms. The most telling words in the Act were those defining wilderness, and I quote, "An area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man." Now, this word untrammeled is a striking choice. People argued about it. Sennheiser stuck fast to it. He's not using the word virgin, which is a sexist term anyway, probably, or untouched, or pristine. None of those words appear, but untrammeled, meaning free, unconfined. A natural world that has not yet been put into bondage or shackled by human demands. To be untrammeled is to experience a freedom of action and self-determination. In this case, the freedom of non-human beings from acts of human domination. That's what the Act says we're after. The community of life should be untrammeled. Since its inception thousands of years ago, agriculture has been a form of trammeling. It's a form of land use driven by attitudes of conquest and domination. So Sennheiser's untrammeled wilderness clearly ruled out farming. Nobody has had any doubts about that, as well as logging and mining. Subsistence, hunting, and fishing are usually more non-intrusive. The Act simply left it to subsequent generations to decide whether those kinds of uses might be allowed or not. But by defining wilderness as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, the Act suggested that such protection should not be applied to places comprised only of rocks and ice, or the lifeless regions of the moon. It should apply only to places where other forms of life dwell. Now, that's most of the planet. I mean, the oceans, etc. There, at least, our fellow creatures are not to be subjected to our economic demands or our aesthetic trammelings. Note something else in this Act. It doesn't say community of life only in high mountain meadows with ponderosa pines. It doesn't say the Northern Rockies. Frankly, I heard last night a lot about this, and I love these places too. But I think sometimes we have narrowed down our concept of wilderness to a stereotype of what we want to go out and experience, which is deeply cultural. And it's far too narrow. The earth and its community of life includes a lot more than meadows and forest in the Northern Rockies. You heard last night that the Wilderness Act protected in the beginning 9.1 million acres. Today it protects 110 million. Initially, the protected areas covered an area only about half the size of the state of Maine. Today it's about 1/3 the size of Alaska, or roughly the size of California. And for all of that expansion, it's still only about 5% of the nation's total land area, though there are more de facto wild areas within the public domain, and still more wilderness or wild areas that have been preserved by state and local governments and by private landowners and by non-governmental organizations. And they include prairies, wetlands, deserts, islands, etc. Virtually everything else, more than 90% of the United States, has been left open to economic domination. For all of its success, therefore, the Act has been only a very small step toward the higher altruism. The rest of the world is now thinking in bigger terms than we do in the United States. The 1992 Earth Summit in Rio recommended that every nation set aside at least 12% of its land base from economic use. The Wilderness Act covers 5%. We can't even get it probably to 10% nationally. But this is now the world standard. It has become a global project. It is a seed that has found its way even to China and other non-Western societies. Now, it's true, they don't all speak in terms of wilderness. That has perhaps some special feelings among Americans only. But I think we get hung up in that word, to be quite honest, and not the point, the purpose, the moral vision behind it. Whether we call it sanctuary or park or preserve or bioreserve, whatever, the practical effects are much the same. More and more land and even parts of the oceans are coming under legal protection and free from economic exploitation. So I would suggest that we need a more global, inclusive language, and we need many languages that essentially bear on the same moral vision. Well, the environmental journalist Bill McKibben, whom I admire a lot, has argued that because of climate change, there's no longer any real wilderness on Earth. Nature's essentially dead. It's all a man-made world. He says this because the combustion of the fossil fuels is changing the global atmosphere, forcing changes on the planet's ecology. He's certainly right about climate change and its causes. But we don't know yet how nature will handle the increase in carbon dioxide, or how easily plants and animals will adapt and move, reorganizing themselves as they did during other epochs of climate change. In any case, McKibben's climate change is not exactly an act of trammeling or domination. It may be influencing nature, but it is not putting places under intensive control or depriving the freedom of the earth, as agriculture and other commodity uses have begun. So perhaps more helpful than as a metric than climate change is how much of the biosphere's production of biomass is being deliberately diverted to support human life. We have a calculation done back in the 1980s from Stanford, Peter Vitusik, Paul Ehrlich, and others. Out of 224 petograms of biomass produced on the planet each year through photosynthesis, they calculate that humans and their livestock directly consume only 7 petograms. That's trammeling at its most extreme. If we include all the environmental effects of cities, croplands, plantations of trees, pastures, then humans could be controlling or trammeling as much as, they say, 40% of all terrestrial, not non-oceanic, net productivity. Other scientists since then have calculated that may be too high. It could be more like 10%, anywhere from 10 to 50%. Even these higher levels, though, would seem to leave a lot of room for untrammeled nature. Protecting wild places and wild creatures was a popular idea back in the 60s. We heard the vote last night from 1964 in the Senate, which went first 73 to 12. Only 12 senators voting against Sonnheiser's bill. In the House of Representatives, the vote was 374 in favor, and only one against, that guy from Texas. James Turner, in his book, demonstrates pretty clearly that, yes, this was a bipartisan moment, but over the last 50 years, the Democratic Party has been far more friendly to wilderness than the Republicans all along. But that was about as much a bipartisan consensus as democracies ever get. We have to remember at that signing in the Rose Garden by Lyndon Johnson, there were a couple of women present. They weren't pictured in the photo last night, but other photos show them. Sonnheiser had died several months before the act was signed. I mean, a terrible irony, a tragic irony. And the former Society president, Otis Murray, was also dead. Their wives were invited to that meeting and honored for their own and for their husbands' achievements. Okay, passage had come at a time of rising ecological concern, national optimism, and confidence that all things are possible in America and that a new era was dawning for the nation and the planet. Yet 5 decades later, this small but popular and significant step in the direction of the higher altruism has become highly controversial. Today, it would have a more difficult time, I would say an impossible time, to get through Congress, either branch. A lot of congressmen would probably want to see it repealed. And in many parts of the country, any mention of wilderness can generate storms of anger, not just in Dillon. This is not because the advocates of wilderness have become fanatics. I don't believe that. Or because they have stopped trying to accommodate their opponents. Why is it then? I think it's because the United States has become a more deeply conflicted and fearful nation. We're not the optimistic country we were then. The cause of nature conservation remained politically strong until the presidency of Ronald Reagan, who tried to brand it as an act of selfishness that would prevent Americans from exercising their God-given rights to become as rich as they could. True, Reagan signed bills adding 11 million acres of protected wilderness, not the last one for Montana, however. At the same time, he appointed people to office who worked relentlessly to open all the public lands to oil, gas, and coal development, to tree cutting, mineral extraction, road building, and motorized recreation, who were determined to block the moral perspective that wildlands preservation signified. Why was that so? What has caused such a backlash that has grown to such a scale and frequency since Reagan's presidency ended in 1988? In my view, what happened was this. Americans came, after the passage of the act, face to face with environmental limits, which made many of them deeply resentful. In 1972, 8 years after the act was passed, the book Limits to Growth was published by the Club of Rome. I'm doing a book on this subject right now, but I think it does bear very much on this subject we're talking about here. The authors, Dennis and Donella Meadows, argued that the United States and the rest of the world face the prospect of a shrinking Earth. The natural world simply could not support infinite growth in the human population or demands for food, water, housing, consumer goods. That book was only one symptom of a fundamental shift in consciousness. Many economists scoffed. The business community was especially appalled by the idea of limits to growth. A large part of the public was also shocked and disbelieving. They could not accept the idea that nature put any limits on human ambition. The future they had hoped to see was one of unlimited economic abundance, and it was disappearing before their eyes. And whatever abundance would be left, they would have to share with increasing numbers of people, many of them immigrants who did not deserve, so many of Reagan's disciples believed, what was left of America's bounty. Reagan based his successful 1980 presidential campaign and his even more successful 1984 re-election campaign on restoring the idea that America was a land of plenty. He told an audience of Southern college students this: "There are no limits to growth because there are no limits of human intelligence, imagination, and wonder. In this vast and wonderful world God has given us," or to the oil companies, "it's not what's inside the earth that counts, but what's inside your minds and hearts, because that's the stuff that dreams are made of, and America's future is in your dreams." So, let's restore the dream of free enterprise and everything will be back. Well, for all his political success, it seems to me Reagan did not allay completely the fears of a shrinking planet and of a coming redistribution of resources that natural limits would force on us. Two critics of the modern environmental movement have bitterly lamented this. They say, "The idea of limits to growth still retains a hold on the public's imagination." This fear of a rising population and a shrinking earth have become more intense since Reagan's presidency. When the Wilderness Act was passed, the U.S. population stood at 192 million. This year, it stands at 317 million, a 40% increase. People are feeling more crowded than ever before, and as a consequence, feeling less generous toward each other and toward the idea of nature conservation. This mood of resentment toward nature conservation is also spreading among people on the bottom ranks of society and their supporters. Conservationists, we are told, lack a sense of social justice. They want to protect nature from exploitation, not only by capitalist ranchers, oil companies, and real estate developers, but also, we are told, by those who are relatively weak in terms of power or money, whether they are American Indians or peasant farmers in Africa. Wilderness preservation now is seen as an aggression against vulnerable people. To exclude those people from any part of the natural world, some argue, is to deny people their intrinsic rights and to collude in their mistreatment. Both kinds of anti-conservationist thinking, which have gathered power over the last few decades, over the last half century, I want to emphasize, offer real and serious moral visions of their own. Both are based on an older anthropocentrism that once ruled human thinking. One group wants to set individuals free to pursue their private economic ambitions to get as rich as they choose. The other group wants to liberate the poor and the working classes from deprivation and to give them resources they need for self-advancement. Neither group seems willing to set any limits to our exploitation of the non-human world. They disagree on whose freedom is most desirable, the rich man's or the poor man's, but not on the goal of removing limits to the appropriation of the earth. In effect, both groups define their moral ideas in terms of justice, which they define in strictly human terms, even as they disagree on what justice means. So far, these backlash movements have not stopped nature conservation from advancing. But over the next 50 years, as populations continue to increase before they peak and then possibly decline, nature conservation will be in a difficult struggle to maintain its momentum. How can nature conservationists stay true to their moral vision while exercising the pragmatism that has made them successful so far? Well, a pragmatist like Aldo Leopold would allow, I think, that all three of these moral visions, economic individualism, redistribution of wealth and resources from the rich to the poor, and the higher altruism, deserve to be heard. All have emerged for good reasons. All may serve some useful function, and all may be necessary to our individual and our collective well-being. He would add, however, and this is, I think, extremely important for all of us in this room, none of them is absolutely true or deserves exclusive authority. The moral pragmatist would grant that social justice is an important principle of modern ethics, even though it is notoriously vague and it lacks consensus. So also is the ethos represented by economic individualism. It too has a certain claim to legitimacy, though once again it is loosely defined and resists any constraint. And likewise, the pragmatist would argue that wilderness preservation, the preservation of nature, nature conservation, is an urgently needed ideal, even though it too often lacks clarity, breadth, and may demand too much. Preservation is a rational, moral response to a shrinking planet in a state of global crisis, including mass species extinction and ecosystem destruction. But it is not the only moral value that we should take seriously. The pragmatist would ask, why can't we accept all of these visions and work toward finding a balance among them, where no one claims absolute truth or demands exclusive authority? But let's face it, such pragmatism does not come easily to a species that has a long record of fighting, sometimes fanatically, over different ways of thinking. And I would suggest that all three of these moral visions have their fanatics. Right now in the United States, the imperative of economic individualism holds the strongest hand politically, while the imperatives of social justice have achieved a considerable power. In contrast, the moral vision behind nature conservation is still weak and defensive. It is younger, it's more vulnerable, and it's more radical. Realistically, it cannot expect to become equal to any of the others anytime soon, and no one should ever expect it to replace them completely. Conservationists should support the idea that humans have a right to appropriate enough resources to live in modest numbers and with modest consumption. The higher altruism cannot succeed if it tries to deny human needs completely. But then conservationists should ask others, how far can we go, and how far should we go in protecting the freedom and autonomy of life transcending our own? Altruism of any kind requires a sacrifice of oneself or one's group for the good of some other unit. Sacrifice can hurt. It can cost lives. When we preserve a mountain forest, a lake, an ocean, a grassland, a wetland, we're not imposing any profound hurt, but we are imposing cost on ourselves and on the human community. Those costs are supposed to be fairly distributed among all citizens, When the international community agrees on preservation goals, it imposes costs that are or should be shared across national borders. Probably no conservationist would argue that those costs should be paid by the poorest and weakest, but rather should be paid mainly by those who can most easily pay them, the rich people and the rich nations. Such a careful distribution of conservation costs across the social ranks and geographical borders of humanity has not always been practiced in the past. Sometimes a few have had to bear the cost by sacrificing their basic livelihood. That's not right. Yet it must also be said that it's not always easy to decide how cost should be calculated and distributed. Have the Blackfeet of Montana, for example, been unfairly compensated for their loss of lands incorporated 100 years ago into Glacier National Park? Have villagers in India been unfairly compensated for yielding their land claims to save the tiger? Have farmers been unfairly saddled with the cost of preserving habitat for migrating birds? Have mining companies been poorly compensated for giving up legitimate claims to minerals in order to save endangered ecosystems? Do parents have an absolute right to demand natural resources for all the children they decide to have, for 3 or 5 or 10 or more children? These are not easy matters to decide. Unless we do so in a spirit of pragmatism and tolerance, the cause of preservation will be resisted. Perhaps we need a better, fairer way to make such determinations. Say, an international court charged with distributing fairly the cost of preserving the world's wild places and threatened habitats. I know, international court, not an American idea. But only those who reject completely the moral vision of nature conservation think there is nothing left to do. They talk of the earth as though it were a thoroughly managed environment, a man-made artifact where nature no longer exists. This is a reductive and it is an absolutistic way of thinking. It is blind and indifferent toward the wildness that still exists, toward the demographic changes occurring in the world, and toward the resilience of organisms to recover and survive. The higher altruism, and I want to emphasize this point, does not require us to follow an impossible standard of Edenic purity. It never has, and it cannot do so in the future. You may have your Garden of Eden idea, but if we adhere to that kind of thinking, then we will not preserve wilderness or wildness on this planet. It does require us to care about any and all life that transcends our human demands and expectations. Thinking in the American West, thinking in the United States, thinking in the world has progressed considerably since 1964. New knowledge about the earth and the vulnerable position we occupy in the universe is pulling us toward the higher altruism. More than Leopold or Sonnheiser or Rachel Carson ever could have done, we can literally see, with the aid of cameras in outer space, just how small and how vulnerable this planet really is. Earth may be the only place in the entire universe, with all its hundreds of billions of galaxies, where life exists. We don't know. And while that life is manifestly a resilient force, able to survive and go on whatever we do, it seems more fragile today when we see it against the dark emptiness of space. We humans have made, and I come to my conclusion, we've made an unmistakable commitment to protect that fragility wherever we can. Nature may be incredibly tough, able and sure to outlast our species. But we have decided, and for good reason, that she needs our helping hand, and we will not turn back from that commitment. Thank you. Thank you very much.
A provocative talk. If there are questions that you would like to pose to Professor Worcester, we have about 10 minutes in which to take those questions. If I'd ask that you come up to the microphone at the front so that everyone can hear your question. Are there any questions? Mm-hmm.
Earlier on in the talk, you mentioned a growing mood of resentment, and then at the end of the talk, which was, so that was kind of like reduced our expectations, and at the end of the talk, you talked about how we now know more, and that even Rachel Carson's would be impressed with how we're approaching. How we're dealing with some of the problems that we now have. So how do you rectify those two things?
That's a good and fair question. I think this mood of resentment is, like many backlashes, not going to last. I don't think it has time on its side. I think even the people who are most angry and resentful right now know in their heart of hearts that this is not the same world they were expecting, and they're going to have to get used to it. So that's my argument here. Yes, the backlash is there. It's raising important questions, but to the extent it's based on the idea that we can go back to the world of infinite plenty and economic growth and so forth that we had enjoyed in the 50s and 60s, I think it's a movement that is condemned by facts and science. So that's why I feel confident that moral change is in the air. Ethics and visions change with facts and with science and with knowledge. That I firmly believe. Maybe I'm too optimistic for this audience, but when I look, I have the privilege of looking at things for 400 or 500 years, backwards and forwards. So, I'm not talking about the next presidential administration and so forth, but if you really take a longer view, it's like the stock market. If you look at it this year, well, it looks really bad. Next year, I don't think the stock market's going to be a model for the future, but I think there is a deeper sense, as the guy I was quoting was Bjorn Lomborg, the skeptical environmentalist from Denmark, who says, no matter how we talk to people, they still have it in their heads that we're facing a limited planet, and that's what I'm basing my views on here. Somebody else have a comment or even a disagreement, a strongly felt or mildly felt disagreement? That's what I think this forum is for.
Yeah, Professor Worst. Thank you for sharing your views and also your experience about China, because you said you went to Renmin University. I'm Shaowen also from China, but I'm from Sichuan Agriculture University. Just came here on a visiting program.
Where are you
I was from Sichuan, Chengdu.
Sichuan? Yeah.
Chengdu.
Beautiful city.
Yeah, thank you. I came here in June, so I stayed here for 3 months already. And also, just based on my observation, I found the connection between people and nature is so close here. And also, I reflect on the situation in China, because I also worked on nature reserve management in Sichuan province. So I went to many panda reserves in China. But I was thinking that the because Taoism is very traditional in China. I mean, traditionally, Chinese people are very close to the nature, but after 80s, after the open door policy, the pressure for the people and also for the government is so, they all have a big pressure. I mean, for the people, they have to work hard. The working pressure is much bigger than before. And also for the government, the economic development becomes the first priority. So, I think to rebuild the connection between people and the nature is still a long way to go.
Well, yes, I appreciate that comment, and it's a very realistic assessment. China has a long way to go, as every country has a long way to go. Maybe I'm so happy being in China, eating such great food and meeting such wonderful people that I've become a little naive, but I have been around the country a lot and seen the numbers of parks and so forth, wildlife refuges that have been established over the last 10 or 20 years. I listened to the top leaders in China talking about something I never hear from anybody in the United States, building an ecological culture, an ecological civilization. It may be greenwashing, but I think they mean something by that. So I've seen wonderful exhibits on how to make a city green and so forth, Tianjin, etc. So I think there is a new attitude in China growing, particularly among younger people. We have an environmental studies center at Renmin University, at good old Renda, which was the training center for the Communist Party cadres. It's now got a very strong program in environmental studies. So things are changing there, and I think positively. It's not only going back, I think if we expected Taoism to save China, I wouldn't have much hope, even though Taoism had many beautiful things about it, and inspired a lot of beautiful mountain preservation, Lushan, many places in your province and also in Jiangxi, for example. But I think it's also an influence coming from the West. People from the Crane Foundation in Wisconsin going to help people in Shandong province save and preserve the red-crowned crane. People are going from Yosemite and Yellowstone National Park to parks and so forth. A guy called me the other day when I was there from Xinjiang province, a very politically conflicted province, way out in the far west, Central Asia really, said, I want to start a wilderness movement in China. I said, who are you? He said, I don't think I can help you, but he said, well, I want to, have businessmen come out here and see this and go camping and hiking. We should have had some of our guys up here last night, take them as guides, into the Xinjiang mountains. These are incredible mountains, bigger than anything in the United States, and, show them what it's like and so forth. He's not interested in making money. He has this wilderness bug. So where did that come from? I don't think it came out of Taoism, but it's there. And I've had students that come to me, tell me about the wolf. I'm so keenly interested in the wild wolves of North America. So, there are seeds that I think are worth keeping in mind and being a little optimistic about. But thank you for your realism. China, you're sitting on the front seat in China over these issues, more than you do here in Montana or Kansas. China, wherever it goes, is really going to be determinative for this planet. So we all have a big interest in it. This will be really heretical to say this, I would stop doing what I'm doing in Montana and go help the Chinese save some of the mountains there.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, I don't really mean that. If you don't speak Chinese, you can't be of too much help.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming, Professor Worcester. And I noticed an overall metaphor I noticed an overall metaphor in your talk, and that's having to do with the seed and this seed of life. But I also sense a paradox in that, Zonheiser and his argument for a community of life. And I'm just curious if we're grounding an argument in life, how you balance that with a move like the one-child rule. And then my question then is something like the one-child rule, is that higher altruism based on your thinking?
Well, that's a very powerful and important question to ask here. If the population of China were 100 million, or even 1 billion, I think that question would have a different context, and I think it's always the context. We cannot maximize every form of life infinitely. That's impossible. The community of life is about balance among populations and so on. Unless we restrain our population, even with some reverence for life, including human life, we are dooming to extinction so many other species on this planet. So a reverence for life should certainly begin with human life, babies, etc. But again, I'm a pragmatist about even the reverence for life. Reverence for which life, etc. It seems to me the context change and truth changes and moral purpose changes, not in its ultimate purpose, but in the way in which we balance these things. That's all I can say that I know how to say on this issue.
I'm an optimist by nature, Professor, but in Australia we're having a few problems. We have no Minister for Science for the first time in many decades. We have a climate skeptic in charge of reviewing alternative energy. We have abandoned our carbon tax and emission scheme. And while our Prime Minister says we're open for business, we're definitely not open for renewable business. We appear to be going backwards, and the balance you looked at in terms of a pragmatic approach seems to be shifting dramatically towards the economic imperialism. I just wondered what sort of advice you might have for trying to re-engage a community that appears to be going in the wrong way, for making a stronger commitment to wilderness and conservation.
So where would that optimist in you go to? That's pretty pessimistic. Well, election cycles are easy to be pessimistic and optimistic about. People got very optimistic about Obama. They'll get very optimistic about whoever succeeds him for a while and so forth. So it goes back and forth. I don't look in terms of election cycles for my optimism. I look more broadly. I don't think that Australians are going to repeal their respect for science in general over infinite time. I think the long-term trajectory has been that we depend more and more upon knowledge, exact knowledge, as much as we can get. It's good to be skeptical about that from time to time, but nonetheless, and I suspect that in another election cycle, these skeptics will be thrown out. So my advice is simply, one, to be patient, keep doing what you're doing, because I think, again, I have to believe that time is on your side.
Hi, thank you for the excellent context you provided. It's really very thoughtful and gives us a lot to think about. I spent a lot of time in local grassroots conversations about potential new wilderness areas. In Montana, we're having these dialogues all over with a lot of local folks coming together, thinking about new additions to the wilderness system. A lot of times those dialogues get pretty entrenched in personal use, personal preference for recreation use, motorized versus non-motorized. Kind of becomes pretty personal about what will this do to my use. How do we encourage, lead, motivate folks to kind of pull back and have that more broader community thinking and think more long-term, broader, altruistic? when their daily lives are pretty entrenched in, their use of these areas?
Oh, tough one, very tough. Maybe we should bring in the philosophers, well, we will in a minute, to tell us how to articulate these. My own quick answer would be, first, we need to expect people to behave better than that. I mean, churches have always done that, expected people to do something besides be selfish or about my personal and so on. Why shouldn't we expect people to behave better? It's a struggle, but, the churches have been at it for a long time, and I think they have done some good work and succeeded. You can't not repeal our fundamental drive for self and selfishness and so on. I mean, that's deep within us. So we can't expect to overcome it, but to try to rise above it, and also, of course, try to show people that they can have it both ways, to some extent, that you can satisfy your personal needs without necessarily sacrificing the whole community of life. I think people are open to that. They don't know how to do it often in a practical way, but I have seen deep surveys made by anthropologists of various interest groups in the United States. It was published some years ago in a book out of MIT Press that looked at loggers in the Pacific Northwest, dry cleaning shops in LA, where they were having a lot of problems with disposing of toxic waste, Earth First people, on and on and on. They looked at all these discrete groups and they did deep surveys into their thinking about these issues, and they found a remarkable consensus. All of these groups overwhelmingly believed that nature has rights. They acknowledged that. Maybe not as good as my right at the moment, but there was this broad agreement on those kinds of issues. They disagreed on a few things. I mean, most loggers didn't go along with vegetarianism, those sorts of things, but in terms of whether, even among the people who are most involved in cutting down trees, mining and so on, they were finding that there was a broad consensus, which I don't think you would have found 100 years ago in American society, perhaps. I don't know. Hard to know, but so I suspect even in the people at the grassroots you're talking to, they do acknowledge somewhere that this is a moral claim, and they want to see these things, and they want to know that they're protected and safe, but right now I've got this thing I want to do. This is my job. This is my work. So, first trying to understand where they're situated, and knowing that they do very likely, most likely have within them a broader moral concern is a starting point, I think, for continuing these conversations and persisting in them. Yeah.
Perhaps just one more question.
Professor, as you know, coal is a big issue here in Montana, and much of that coal ends up in China. I heard a professor here at the University of Montana say earlier this year in a public meeting that the new 5-year, or perhaps it was a 10-year plan in China, is to phase out the use of coal. And my question for you is, do you think the Chinese leadership is serious about this, in your opinion?
Well, I think they're very serious about phasing out and getting rid of coal around the big cities, which are suffering from air pollution problems. My concern is that they'll just move these, it's mostly coming from electric generating plants. That's how they get their electricity in China. The alternative so far has been hydro, like Three Gorges, and they deserve to have electricity in China as much as you or I have it. So coal is all they've got, and coal in the winter to heat water to keep warm. And it's cold in Beijing in the winter, believe me. Very, very cold. And so I'm in favor of staying warm. They don't have many options, but I think they're pretty serious about, they have to be, because they're going to have a political revolution on their hands if this air pollution problem isn't solved, and it's now in every major city. If they simply move these places into the countryside and let all that stuff waft over to the United States, they're going to be in international hot water. So I think they are serious, but they did project at one point they were going to start building new coal power plants every week. But they're also investing more in solar energy than any other country on the earth, wind energy. So China's trying to cover all of its bets at once and go forward on all fronts at once. I don't know how serious. I've never talked to Xi Jinping personally. I don't know. I can't probe the man's mind and know how serious he is about these issues. But my feeling is that they are very getting to be finally very concerned about coal burning, and that markets for coal in the future in China are going to dwindle as it should everywhere. We shouldn't be burning coal. Not until we figure it out, if we can figure it out, how to put the coal back into the ground somewhere, and I don't think we're going to do that anytime serious. The Chinese are also lined up to buy, the oil sands, the shale oil, or the sands oil from Alberta. I've just been up there on the Athabasca River looking at those issues, and that's going to dwarf coal if they have their plans, they in Venezuela. So we better be worried not only about Montana coal, but about oil sands. Well, that was, I'm told, the last question. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for your attention and chance to come here. Thank you.